right, well, let's begin. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are in the Implementing Grouper ABAC webinar. Thanks for joining today's IAM Online. Our monthly webinar focused on identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. My name is Jean Horoszewski. I'm the InCommon Academy Director, and I'm today's host. And we're going to get started, but just before we do, a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We have our welcome, and I'll be giving a little bit of an intro to today's topic and our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them for today's presentation, followed by a QA and our closing session. So welcome. We're so happy that you're here. We're excited about today's topic. But just a few reminders as we get into today's program. We will be taking questions and comments, and we'll be using the live Zoom Q&A function within Zoom. So please do send your questions and your messages to our speakers, and we will address them a little bit later in the segment. But you know what? You can also put comments in the chat, and that goes to everyone. And just be sure that you select everyone in the drop-down when you put your comments in chat. Many of you asked, this event is being recorded, so if you are registered for IAM Online, you will receive an email with a link to the recording as well as slides. But we also post this on the InCommon website as well as our IAM Online YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. All right, well, how about if we dive in and set the stage for today's topics? As you know, universities are really complex ecosystems, aren't they? And well, there's a lot of diverse access needs. You know, there's students, there's faculty, staff, researchers, external partners, so many, each requiring different levels of access. And, you know, for some of you who come from larger institutions, this complexity probably spans multiple campuses and multiple departments. And so, you know, when we think about this landscape, how do you manage access and resources? It can be challenging for lots of reasons. You know, roles are everywhere. Each group of stakeholders has their own set of unique needs, and trying to define roles that fit everyone into nice little buckets is a little like, well, herding cats, I suppose. Traditional role-based access control, RBAC for short, can fall short in a lot of situations, leaving gaps or maybe even overcomplicating things. There's also a wide variety of attributes to consider, whether it's affiliations, job classifications. So for example, employees with both faculty and staff roles, or maybe students who have multiple or in joint programs. And I know that solutions like reference groups and custom loaders can help. Sometimes there's a scalability or efficiency challenges there. So these challenges have led some institutions to explore alternative approaches, including the implementation of attribute-based access control, or ABAC for short, within Grouper, which is an open source group management software and one of InCommon's trusted access platform components. So today we are going to hear from the University of Michigan about their experience implementing Grouper ABAC. Our speakers are Gail Lift, Application Developer Lead, and Bruce Timberlake, Senior Application Systems Administrator. And they will share their insights today on their Grouper ABAC journey and hopefully provide some valuable perspectives to you all on their approach to access management. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our speakers. So Gail, Bruce, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much for the platform to talk about this and share some of our experiences with Grouper as we've been trying to follow along with it. So you can go to the first slide. This gives a little bit of sense of scale. As you mentioned, some universities are fairly large, fairly diverse ecosystems. University of Michigan is made up of 19 different schools and colleges. We've got, 61,000 undergrad and graduate students and 54,000 faculty and staff spread across Ann Arbor, Flint, and Dearborn campuses, plus the hospital that rely on our systems for single sign-on, for all access to things. And so we face a lot of challenges in this diversified environment. Unit IT likes to own their own configurations and things like that. So we're have an eye towards setting up Grouper to help that. Go to the next slide. The identity and access management team is relatively small. We have 23 members. That includes everybody from our director down to, the newest sysadmin that just got hired, split into developers, business analysts, and then operations staff. We have a 3-member on-call rotation, so we're always looking to keep things running and manage things as efficiently as possible and not take on work that, frankly, we just can't do ourselves. The big major components that our team owns and is responsible for are listed here, probably similar to what a lot of campuses have: person registry, LDAP, single sign-on, a large and growing Active Directory and Entra, formerly Azure portfolio, and then of course Grouper, and then backing it all currently is MIT Kerberos. And our team owns over 250 servers and 2 data centers and a bunch of stuff out in the cloud on AWS. So next slide. Just to recap, as Gene mentioned, the RBAC, role-based access control, was sort of I wouldn't necessarily call it a de facto standard, but it's what people kind of used for a while. It made sense. You could grant access to not fine-grained populations, but it was a way to define who people were instead of trying to grant individual people access to things. That definitely doesn't scale. And then as people change jobs and things like that, then people retain access to things that they shouldn't. It's slow to get access to things that they need. And so first assigning it based on role was a pretty good solution, but in higher ed, that's tough because people are very diverse. You can have somebody who's a staff member, a faculty member, might still be a student, maybe on a different campus, and so managing all that stuff becomes pretty complex. So when Grouper announced that they were going to develop the developers announced that this attribute-based access control might be a thing, we were very interested because our initial foray into reference groups wasn't quite as successful as we hoped. You can go to the next slide. And so just a little bit about reference groups in general. And I'm skipping basis groups because at Michigan, we have a system we refer to as M Community that actually does what basis groups kind of do, where we take data from feed sources like our student administration system and HR system and the banner systems on some of our other campuses and sort of pre-digest and assign roles to people in that system. And then Grouper uses that as an source data source. So we kind of skipped the basis groups and went straight to reference groups. These are good for standard populations everybody can agree on. It's pretty, if you say all faculty, that seems like everybody should be able to agree what all faculty should mean. But as we found, users don't necessarily want those standardized populations. And if you try to make reference groups that will please everybody, you're going to make many, many, many that don't get used, or you're still customizing them, things like that. And then the other thing we found was, especially in people with multiple appointments, if you parse that data too finely, context becomes difficult to maintain when you try to reassemble it. And it's very easy to misrepresent population sizes or put the right job, title or role with the right departments and things like that. So next slide, please. So first we started with the reference groups. And there's a couple of slides here that have screenshots of the Grouper UI. They're not necessarily the easiest to read, but so we started with these reference groups based on institutional roles first, and then next slide. When those weren't 100% useful, we kind of thought to ourselves, what might the teams and units around campus find useful? So we started building other reference groups that included more detail based on things like departments, department groups, VP areas. These are some internal, HR delineations that we already had in our data. You notice the count down there, that 15,000 whatever, and we had a couple other groups I didn't put on the slide here. So we created these 17,000 groups thinking that, hey, this will solve everybody's problem. Next slide, please. And they didn't. So we had some examples here of problems that we had from users. Somebody thought that a staff group should not contain students, which are grad student instructors specifically who have a staff role at Michigan. But they were under the impression, or they wanted a group that truly was staff only, because it was granting access to things that maybe they didn't think that students should have. We had another user that needed to distinguish, faculty wasn't a fine-grained enough approach. They needed to say, well, I'm interested in teaching faculty, but I want to exclude people who work for the library. I don't know what their use case was, but that was a thing that they brought to us and said, yeah, we need something different. Filtering based on faculty role had too many people because that person's interpretation of faculty was somebody who is primarily faculty, not somebody who might have a secondary appointment as a faculty member. Or somebody just couldn't find a reference group out of that list of 17,000 or so that we made that actually fit their needs. So next slide, please. So then, as Jean mentioned, also custom loaders can be a solution around this, where you encode the rules for the group membership in the loader itself. But we didn't think that would scale too well because we have a lot of departments, and even if each one only needed one or two or a couple of custom loaders, that's a lot of custom loaders. And as I said, we're a very small team. We just don't have the bandwidth to do that. And we could do that on special requests, but as we went out to campus and introduced Grouper to people, every request was a special request. And then also you've got things like credentials and certificates to keep up to date. You need more resources to run and schedule all of those loader jobs. And then maybe the loader, the rules on how it works, points at something like a spreadsheet where it's not clear or easily obvious what the rules are that are governing membership in that group. So next slide. So Grouper ABAC was the solution, or is the solution that we believe is going to help us manage these, customized one-off requests, and also give the IT and the units in those colleges around the various campuses the ability to do this stuff, customize things for themselves. So it gives them the ability to customize it when they can't agree with what we're presenting as a reference group. Once the group has been loaded as ABAC data, if you want to call it that, it's then available for other people to use, provided that the security requirements are met and things like that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another thing is Grouper has composite groups where you can do group math and combine, this group plus this group, or this group and not this group, or whatever. But if you got relatively complex rules where maybe you have 3, 4, 5 different things that you need to consider for the ultimate, group membership. Composite groups were 2 groups at a time. And so if you have multiples, you might need to create a lot of intermediate composite groups that are useful only to hold data on its way to being a final group. And that's inefficient, things like that. So ABAC allows you to directly consume multiple attributes all in one. And then the overall model for us, like I said, we're trying to set this up in a way that unit IT can do this for themselves. So with training and allowing or doing it this way rather than having to train people on how to write loaders and provisioners and then provide resources for them to schedule things and hope they're doing their SQL queries in an efficient manner and all that sort of stuff. That just seemed like it was going to be a bad option for us. The one big caveat that I'll circle back to is people making groups need to understand the source data. It's really easy to kind of browse through and find something that looks like what you think is what you care about, but maybe it's not. And so that could cause issues if the people don't understand the data and their group membership is, doesn't end up as what they expect because they're basing it on information that they didn't necessarily understand. Next slide, please.
Bruce, before we go on,
Sure.
I don't know if this is answerable right now, but a question came in: how big, CPU or RAM wise, are your grouper daemons?
So we have 2 of them right now. They are running on virtual machines that have, I probably should. I'll look at that and I'll have the answer by the end. They're not ginormous. I think they're 8 cores and 32 gig of RAM. But I'll double check while Gail's talking, and then I'll have the final answer at the end. But that's currently where we're at. Is we have two daemon servers, one in each of our data centers, and they're sized the same. And we use the Grouper deployment guide when setting all this stuff up. So if you don't know about the Grouper deployment guide, it's a useful resource to get started, at least as far as scaling and sizing and things like that go. So the ABAC basics, right, is bringing your data into Grouper while keeping the context. So an example here, or the ABAC data is sort of known as a row made up of fields, and the fields are the individual elements that make up that row. Next slide. So here's one that might need context. If you have a reference group that's all faculty and another one that's employees in department 187000, you can't necessarily directly combine them to get a faculty that are in 187000. If you it might miscount John here, or not properly recognize that he's got two different jobs. And while we're focusing on HR data right now, student data can become a lot more complicated. Students with major, multiple minors, taking multiple classes in each semester. So that is a category of data that we are about to start tackling, but haven't yet. We've been focused on HR-based groups for access control for units on campus. But student data is a whole nother bigger potential problem that ABAC should be much more efficient for. Next slide, please. So the Grouper UI, you define the fields. So you give each field, a name. You can set the privacy realms, a bunch of stuff here that I'm not necessarily going to read, but using the UI is pretty straightforward to define the actual fields themselves. Next slide. And then you combine those into a row that also gets a name, so you can refer to it. You can see here, this one's called UMich HR job row. And so naming things is always hard in anything to do with computers. And this is where you run the risk of, if you name something too vaguely, somebody who's using this later on might not necessarily understand what it is and things like that. So this is something to think about up front, is naming things obviously, so that external users, or even yourself, if you come back later, can remember, what's the difference between HR job row and, I don't know, something else that sounds similar to HR job row, but isn't. Next, please. And then you choose the data source that this is going to come from, and you write the query that will pull the data from that source and map it into the fields. These queries use Jexel, Java Expression Language. And the next slide, please. So this is a simple example, right? We have a user who says, I need faculty whose primary department is psychology. So then we say, all right, well, that's job rows that have job category faculty. The department ID is psychology is 185500. Job indicator is primary faculty assignment, and then the employment status is active. So in the loader, you add this Jexel script here. And this would be an example of understand the data, right? Job indicator may not be obvious to somebody that means primary or secondary appointment role, right? So this could be a case for naming something more clearly or picking a different name, but this is what we've got at the moment. Next slide, please. So our initial implementation before ABAC was we would get this XML data from PeopleSoft, and we had code that would pack it and decorate it, stick it on the identity data in our registry, our identity vault, and then retrieve it with LDAP. You can go to the next slide, please. And then that would create a table in Grouper with a row for each job. And then Grouper would query that to build the reference groups. These are all those 17,000 reference groups we built that nobody's using. But this is how we set it up initially. So now, next slide, please. Using ABAC, we still have the same intermediary table that gets that data out of the LDAP directory. But now it's defined. You can see here, UMich HR job row has, each row is one job, and the fields in there have all of these attributes. And then you can just select that as listed here. So it's a little easier to read and builds these individual rows so you can keep your context, right? That's the important thing, is understanding the data and then keeping the context when you put it back together. it's accurate. Next slide, please.
Sorry to interrupt, Bruce,
Oh,
but
sure.
this might be relevant in this very moment. There's a question from Chris Heiser. Do you use the data field data dictionary to document
Yes.
that valid values in the field in the row?
Yeah, we do that a little bit, but I think we're going to use that more in the student data when we start putting that up.
Yep. And then Gail, I don't remember exactly where we said we were going to hand off to you, so I think I'll do one more slide, and then I think it's your
Okay, that's fine.
half. So here's some examples of data row definitions that we have created as ways to help people, right? So primary faculty with a primary appointment in a specific department, a group that's only tenured faculty, a group that is just GSIs, graduate student instructors in a certain department. So then group math could be done to subtract them out of that staff group that somebody didn't want them in. So these are, you can see they're a little easier to understand, and it's not locked away in loader definition or something like that. It's a little more straightforward, and reading it, if you need to make changes later on, it's my opinion is this is much easier to tweak, change, clone, what have you. So next slide, please. And then Gail, I'll let you.
Okay. Can you attend to some of the questions that are
Yes.
coming in?
Yeah, infrastructure stuff. Yeah, I'll look all those up.
Okay, so where are we? All right. So this is a little screenshot of what happens after you enter your Jexel script. You type in this, you enter your script and say analyze, and then Grouper will go through each clause in your script and say how many people match to it. And as you notice up here, you can even give a specific person and say, do they or do they not match this group? When we first got I'm being confused by all the mouse pointers moving around, sorry. When ABAC was first implemented, that wasn't part of it. And I can tell you from personal experience that makes it a lot easier to use. Next slide, please. So as an example of how Grouper V5 made our life better, the OVPR, Office of the Vice President for Research, came to us with an SSO request. And in addition to the usual stuff, they said, oh, by the way, we need authorization based on 198 job codes. Yay. So in the past, we would have made a custom loader or made a group in some other way that the SSO system could get to it. But this is the first one that popped in the door. How many more are going to be like this? Who wants to maintain all these job codes, lists, etc. in the new way? Next, please. I got this into Grouper using some regex and done. There it is. The Office of the Vice President for Research has the ability to make changes to it when they update the list of job codes required. They're in business. A few minutes work, which is to us really amazing. And if somebody come to us a year ago with this request, it would have been, yeah, that's nice. So did we lose oh, sorry. We handed off in a different spot than I had initially expected.
Sorry.
No worries. We'll get there. So at the moment, our group, our little Grouper group in the IAM team is making these at least initial ABAC scripts. We expect to be able to share this task out to at least unit IT people and people who are basically computer savvy enough to be able to do this on their own. And at that point, I think by and large we'll have a library of examples, like the samples you saw a few slides back, that help people decide, oh, this will do it, that'll do it. But there still is going to be the occasional problem with people need more advice from experts. So we're going to have to work with the data experts in HR and the registrar's office to figure out how to help people without creating an extra burden on the expert offices. I mean, for example, how did I know that instead of all 198 of those job codes, I could replace a bunch of them with 4 job families? Well, I am an expert in the data, or half an expert in the data, maybe. So that's something we still have to work out, is how we can make sure people are able to do what they need to do without mistakenly doing the wrong thing or without making us do all the work for them. Next, please. So how can you join in this party? It is fun. We're getting things done we couldn't do before. And so I encourage you to join. First, obviously, upgrade to Grouper v5. It, yes, is the development version, but it is production ready. Ian, I don't know an easy way except for what I just did. Decide what affiliation data is going to be needed for access to decisions. And if you yourselves have not gotten this experience, then by all means, consult with your data experts, with the registrar and the student teams and the HR office. We actually did this in the construction of our IAM system, the current one. So we have been using this kind of detailed data for about 10 years. So if you haven't done that, please go and get the expert help. Otherwise, it's embarrassing. Okay, so decide on that data or get some help deciding on that data, and then define those data elements in Grouper. It's pretty easy. Liam showed you how to do that for which? Liam showed you how to do that. I just noticed that it says sets permissions for which and stops. That's set permissions for who will be able to access which kinds of data elements. So if, for instance, you're worried about protecting FERPA data from everybody in Grouper, then you can say that that people need to be properly trained and qualified before they can access the student data. And you can set permissions so that the rest of the people cannot. At the moment, we have not done that. As we roll it out to units, we will be doing that.
So we do have one, so we have an online training application at Michigan, and we have defined a very rudimentary sort of presentation on how to use Grouper, and people have to take and pass that class, so to say, and have it recorded in the training system for them to be able to log into the UI for Grouper. So we've protected Grouper itself using a mechanism like that, so that not just any random person who's got a login credential at Michigan can log in and start using it. You have to have taken this class and passed it and have that recorded on your record to be able to get in. So that's one example, a simple example, not using ABAC, but it does a lookup into this course system to see if you passed it when you try to log in.
Well, it's kind of ABAC in a way. So once you define the elements, write yourself a query against whatever data source, LDAP or SQL. You saw our query for HR data back a ways. It was actually quite simple in our case. The student one will probably be a little messier. I'm working on that now, but it's not that hard. Crank up the data, load the data into Grouper, and then have some fun making groups that you couldn't make before. Next, please. So how did this work for us? Why are there so many distractions in this world? Anyway, how did this work out for us? So when the Grouper developers started talking about we need to do more ABAC-like things, our ears went up quickly. And I sat down and made some samples for the Grouper team about the kinds of things that we needed, and discussed it with people, discussed more with the Grouper team. Basically, we engaged with other universities and we engaged with the Grouper team. And then when the Grouper team released the first version of this, which was definitely marked, do not put this in prod yet, we tried it out in dev. I stumbled around in the dark. Chris Heiser bailed me out and showed me how to do things. We asked a lot of questions of others. We traded ideas around. We found the occasional bug and reported the developers. And the Grouper team listened, made some changes. We tried it out in dev. We stumbled around in the dark. We asked questions, etc. And that went around for a few times. And then we got a production quality version of Grouper 5 with ABAC. Next, please. So just a quick example of one of the improvements that they made after I stupidly tried to get a 200-line Jexel query into Grouper. Is that, remember that query that you saw a few slides back that wasn't short, but definitely fit on the slide? This is the version before that. It's 137 lines long, falling out of the bottom of the screen. It's not easy to read. It's even harder to maintain. And it's certainly easy to make a mistake and not realize it. So Grouper team saw that and they said, oh, a list function would fix that. So Grouper got a list function. We got a much more readable query. Next, please. And just in case you don't remember that detailed slide, here's another view of it. So the new function is right where it says on line 3, it says job code. The equal tilde is in list. Cool. And we are so pleased to have that. So the moral of my story, or our story, next please, is Grouper ABAC is really useful. It's been useful to us. We've got more queries coming in or more requests coming in, but you do need to understand the data. And if you can believe it, yesterday I found a bug in our student data, even though I do understand it. Install Grouper v5. Please get the most recent edition, which I think is 5.11.2 or thereabouts. Give it a try in your non-prod system and get involved with others who are using it and with the Grouper team. If you get involved, you help everyone else and you help yourself and you get the features that you need. So I think we've now got a pile of questions. That was the end, wasn't it?
We got one more. So we're going to be at
Questions.
TechX in December.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, so this is, we didn't go a lot into the weeds with technical, or not technical, but specific implementation details, just because we were trying to keep it sort of high level here and as the concept of ABAC and how it's so great and trying to get everybody to be involved. But we're going to have a more in-depth presentation joint with the University of Virginia, where we both wanted to talk about Grouper. So the TechX folks said, can you do a combined presentation? And so we are. But we'll be there, and then we'll be there for the A Camp and Birds of Feather sessions and things like that too. So if we can't answer your questions here, come see us in December at TechX.
And all three of us will be there, including Liam.
Exactly. So yeah, so one of the questions is about Tap Workbench not having Grouper 5. I don't have any insight into that. I don't know if Chris or somebody in the background can speak to that.
Can Chris raise his hand and speak to that?
Yeah.
She's still there.
Yes. Chris Heiser, we are allowing you to talk. Go for it.
I have no information on that. No, I'm just joking. The tap workbench is tightly integrated with Grouper, and there's a lot of moving parts. There was a question in the Q&A about how easy it is to upgrade from V4 to V5, and I'm sure the workbench is going to have similar issues. So it also depends on if you want sort of the experimental stuff or you want the stable stuff. And I'm not sure what is more appropriate for the tap workbench, but I could see them, wanting to be more on a stable branch and the less bleeding edge. So I don't know that there's a plan for that. So you'd have to follow up with Paul.
But Grouper V5 has gotten pretty stable. I mean, the most recent version is always a little bleeding edge.
Yeah.
How long have we had 5.8 in prod?
Well, as far as the upgrade goes, so we were really early adopters before. I mean, it was still like call Chris and have him walk you manually through the steps to do it. That's, as my understanding is, that's not a requirement. It's gotten much more stable and helpful in the upgrade process. So I can't speak directly to it because we did it the hard, painful manual way. Well, I shouldn't say hard and painful, but there was a lot of manual steps and tinkering and trying to get stuff to work when we did the conversion over a little over a year ago. I think close to almost a year ago. It was, oh no, sorry, it was right after. Yeah, I don't remember exactly when it was, but we've been running V5 for a while.
Paul did just post in the chat that the workbench is going to Grouper 5 soonish. So
okay,
that's good.
Awesome.
Right. And Bruce, I don't know if what you just said answered another question earlier. How much work was it for you to upgrade to Grouper?
Yeah, so I mean, once we saw that we were going to want to do it, we just kind of did it. I mean, like I said, there was some back and forth with Chris, some hand holding. We use Exadata as our database backend, which is not typical. So we're sort of that, special case Oracle user that Chris has to worry about. So I don't recall any major problems. It was just, we had to go through a certain sequence and a certain step to get the database upgraded, and deploying the code was simple, right? The containerized deployment was pretty straightforward. It was, migrating the database, I think, was probably the tricky part, if you want to call it that. So we just made sure we made sure we had a snapshot of the database before we started. And I believe at least once in dev we reverted and then re-upgraded again because something didn't go right once or something. So as with always, do it in non-prod first. Don't just assume it's going to work and throw it in prod right away.
So
we were doing it bleeding edge at that point.
Three follow-up questions to that. For authentication, you migrated from the SHIB SP to OIDC, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't have any users using SOAP web services, right?
No. Yeah, that's the next thing we're about to start tackling is letting people do that or start using that ourselves in solutions. Right now it's all UI point click stuff.
And when you say that, you mean REST web services, right?
Correct. Yes.
Not SOAP.
Oh yeah, not SOAP. Yeah.
And then how many legacy provisioners did you have that had to be migrated to the provisioning framework?
None. That was another thing. Our very first investigation of Grouper was before the new framework was around, and for that and a few other reasons, we decided to hold off, and we've only used the new provisioning framework from the beginning, so we didn't have any legacy stuff to migrate.
And our experience when we started with the new provisioning framework was pretty much like our experience with ABAC, that we tried things out, we reported what we found, we asked questions, we talked to folks, and the Grouper team made quick improvements. They responded to questions. I mean, it was really a good experience. So when we went live in prod with Grouper for the first time, it was on the new provisioning framework. And then when we upgraded to V5, besides the database changes, everything else was new stuff. So there wasn't, there weren't any problems with existing provisioners or things like that.
Yeah. So since we're relatively new to Grouper university, it's been, I would call it pretty easy overall for us because we've just stayed on the bleeding edge and you know, like Liam's been super good, especially with, with SHIB. He's engaging with the SHIB developers in the Slack channel, and we engage with the developers for Grouper in the Slack channel all the time. So anybody who's hesitant to do that or is whatever, please don't be. It's a great environment, and we've gotten features that are helpful to us, which hopefully will be helpful to other people, but we know they help us. And by engaging and asking questions at the, we get stuff we want. So you should do it too.
Bruce and Gail, there's quite a few other questions.
Okay.
Let's maybe start from the top down. Would you please share your approach for prompting group owners to review the members of their group on a regular basis? What's your similar to
Not
access
yet.
reviews for on-track?
Yeah, we're actually not really doing that yet. We've got relatively few sort of groups that need that, right? So ours are kind of ABAC-y reference groups. So it's a thing we need to do, but we're not really doing it yet. So
Okay.
I don't know if that's a sufficient answer or not.
I'll skip the next one because I'll get to the training in just a second. But how many team members are assigned to working on just Grouper management?
None.
Yeah, we don't have any that are just Grouper. We have a sort of core team that is Gail, myself, Liam, and we have a business analyst who does a lot of the engaging with departments who want to use Grouper to understand their requirements. So there's 4 of us, but Grouper is by no means even a primary assignment.
And in fact, one of the other developers is starting a project which will help him get more familiar with Grouper. And that is kind of the way we do things. There may be 1 or 2 people who are sort of experts, but everybody has some knowledge and some help.
Yeah. Chris Heiser offers some additional information in the Q&A section on upgrading to version 5. So check that out. But Jeffrey is asking, is there any concept of an attribute governance process, or are there any plans for any?
There is attribute governance in that everything that gets into Grouper has come from the IAM system, and there's governance there. And everything we have is basically determined by the sources record owners. So the HR department has said, this is how you determine that somebody counts as employed here. This is how you determine whether they are considered X or Y. All of that comes right from there, and we do the same with student data. So yes, there's governance. One of the advantages to having people do this sort of stuff through Grouper rather than going to, say, the institutional data warehouse and grabbing random data and doing it is that we have that governance already. And it's much more likely that people will make good decisions and good choices.
Right. Slightly longer question here. Excuse me, one guest says, they're using an old version of Grouper behind a custom REST API and UI that uses the REST API. They have 100K of reference groups, looking at standing up a new greenfield Grouper instance for the 17K reference groups you produced. Do you have an external process that creates new reference groups, or is there a loader configuration that he's missing that will provision new groups into a folder when new departments or job codes show up? Is this the selection loader part of GDG? That's a long start.
Yeah, our data like that, job codes, department IDs, student programs, all of that stuff changes on the fly. So all of our loaders are built to take in whatever it is that changes. I mean, if a new field that's, say, important to job data shows up, somebody, probably me, is going to have to manually go in and add it and stick it in the loader query, but that's it. The rest is going to happen automatically.
Mhm.
And our reference groups for HR data are all built by one query that goes into some data that we sort of pre-organized. The tables that I showed you earlier that has like 1 row for each job, that table has, that table and a couple of others have views on them that kind of set the stage for what's going to go into the reference groups. And then the SQL loader does the work, and we're happy to share that stuff.
Well,
Given that reference groups don't work well for us, you can have it and keep it.
Right. Well, thanks for that offer to share in case anybody wants to get in contact with you. Next question, would you be able to view or access Grouper automating U of M groups for university business off the U Michigan website?
Yeah, that's the course that I talked about.
Okay.
I'd have to look at it. I don't think there's a reason we couldn't share it. I don't think we can obviously grant access through MyLink because you'd have to have a U of M credential for that. But I think we could probably review it and put it together and make it available somehow.
Yeah, we can grab
Says
the
a presentation.
content.
It's really just a presentation. It's a bunch of slides you click through, and then
Yeah.
at the end say, yes, I will follow these rules and I understand this.
Right. Great.
And it's mostly, there's as much protect personal data as anything else in there.
Yeah.
Cool. Next question from David. Looks like these examples require pretty in-depth knowledge of job codes. What kind of the opposite of GDG idea of hiding the arcane codes of basis groups with reference groups? Does that mean that based on your experience, the whole reference group concept didn't actually work for you and you're saying, screw
Well,
it, you need to understand the raw HR data?
It's not that the reference group concept didn't work. It's that the users, those weren't useful populations. Everybody wanted, yeah, I like that group, but they want something else. And so ABAC definitions of the groups allows easier, yeah, I like that, but and they can have a customized version, start with that reference group definition maybe as a starting point, and that, or whatever. But yeah, and it requires some knowledge of the data. It does require some scripting or query building, if you want to call it that. But that's that is part of the requirement. You do have to have a certain level of knowledge and understanding to use a lot of these systems because of the power that they have. So
All right.
And some of this stuff is just ugly looking codes. There's just no way around it.
and that's because of the user requirement, right? If they could have used nice, clean reference group we gave them, it would have been easy. But no, they said, here's a list of 190 job codes that we want to be defined in a group. There's no way around that if that's the requirement.
Andy says, maybe this is a strange question, but can you mix role-based data reference groups with ABAC?
Yeah, for instance, one thing that I did for somebody was, and this is kind of a cousin of the I don't want students in my HR group, is we have institutional role groups for the sort of gross roles like student Ann Arbor, enrolled student Ann Arbor, faculty Flint, temp staff Dearborn, stuff like that. And we have a Jexel script that takes the requirements for the department staff and then subtracts out of that anyone who's in the institutional role student Ann Arbor group. So yeah, we mixed them.
Yeah, I mean, groups
That's
are
a good
groups.
question, Andy.
Yeah, but exactly. And that leads a little bit into the next question. Are we going to retire our standard reference groups that we created before ABAC? Come to TechX in December because we are planning to do some performance testing and see if we can use ABAC style queries to build the same type of groups and go all ABAC and not have necessarily a lot of loaders that are building these things in the old style.
Yeah,
big thing there is performance. But that's going to be one of the technical points in our talk in December.
And it's probably the case that the really gross level groups like institutional roles that are useful, there's no reason not to let those stay around as reference groups. But it might be that they'll be updated faster if you use them from ABAC,
Yeah, so we're going to do some, like I said, some performance testing, some internal querying to see, because it sure would be nice to do everything all one way, and then that way everybody's only got to learn one way to do stuff and not, oh, if you're doing this kind of group you need to do it this way, and if you're doing this kind of group you do it this other way. So
Yeah.
it'd be nice to standardize, but we need to do some more testing.
Mhm.
We also need to see what it is that is more useful across maybe not all departments, but say throughout the College of Engineering or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, where we don't want everybody ending up with a slightly different variation of what should have been the same thing.
Good point. Reading the next question from another attendee, would you please explain your deprovisioning process for access? Is it configured so that once an account no longer has the attribute, it is automatically removed from the group and the access for that group provides? In other words, when an employee leaves their job, is their account removed from the groups that require the employee attribute?
Yep.
Yes, that is the whole reason for using a system like Grouper that does this stuff and watches the values automatically for you, so a person doesn't have to go around and removing people from groups manually, because that doesn't happen in a timely fashion. So yes, that is exactly what happens there. And any other attribute that's in an ABAC rule defined group, right? So you keep your position, but you change to a different department. If you had department specific access or group memberships, those will go away, and then you automatically be plunked into groups that have the new department number or whatever in it.
Wow. Great questions, everyone. Who else? Anyone else out there thinking about their environment and pondering some of these questions for themselves? Any more questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat either.
So one quick question: if we do decide that we can share that training course presentation or whatever, what's a good mechanism to do that? Jean, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
well, we can certainly keep folks tuned in via our Slack and email list, but if there's a particular way that we can get information back out to this webinar's attendees, then we can follow that mechanism as well. So stay tuned, we'll investigate a little bit of that as well. You do have one more question coming in, or a couple. Does the ABAC group's data get loaded on a scheduled basis, just like the loader groups? Are ABAC groups basically loader groups?
We should probably have Chris answer some of that, but yeah, the data is actually brought into Grouper by a daemon job that loads the data, brings it into Grouper tables, and that makes it faster and more efficient. And we might talk more about that in detail in December. We're trying to keep this high level.
But yeah, basically
But
there is a scheduled job that runs to put the
Yeah.
data in Grouper, and then there's other processes that do the ABAC stuff.
Right, but it's a little different than loader groups in that the process brings the data into Grouper pretty raw, and then each group has its own rules that
Right.
that form the loader. Chris, you want to chime in?
Well,
Yeah, so it's loosely coupled in that way. Right now, it's just a full-time sync, and I've been talking to Gail a little bit about making it incremental as well, so that as soon as the data comes into the grouper tables, it'll also affect the group. So it's sort of a work in progress, but that's how it works.
there's
Another
a,
We're
plug for
syncing pretty
engaging with-
frequently.
Yeah, but that's another plug for engaging with the developers.
and there's a comment in the chat that maybe everyone can't see. Does it get loaded by the Jexel loader?
No. Well,
So right
depends on
now,
what you mean.
there's not a loader for every group that has an ABAC script, but the Jexel loader that's in V4 is essentially the ABAC loader on V5. So I think the answer to that is yes, if that's what you're asking.
Kind of yes, but put Grouper 5 up in development and see for yourself.
See for yourself for sure. Well, speaking of Grouper, I know there was an attendee today asking about training. So Jennifer, my colleague, is gonna paste a link in the chat for everybody. But if you come to the InCommon website, we have just released our fall training schedule, which includes Grouper. So if you scroll down, you'll see that we have two Grouper training sessions coming up. One right away, coming up August 19th, through the 22nd. So there's time still to register for that one. You can do that here on our website. And if you can't make the August one, we're going to be hosting another one later in November, and we'll be opening up registration in just a few weeks for that one. So if you are interested in Grouper or any of the other components, this is the place that you can go. And then finally, just to close us out here today, and seeing that there are no more questions, perhaps, I'm gonna just close us out with no more questions. And just wrapping up here, very much want to thank our guests, Bruce and Gail, for sharing really practical and helpful insights on how you did this. And it sounds like you two are very open to getting questions even after this webinar and sharing some more. And it sounds like everybody come to TechX, because there'll be great collaboration to be had there as well. So if you haven't registered for TechX, that registration is open for that too on the Internet 2 website.